In the sleepy rural town of Fairview, Missouri, life moved at a slow, predictable pace. Nestled among rolling hills and sprawling fields, the Collins family seemed to epitomize the idyllic small-town life. Their modest house, with its white picket fence and well-tended garden, was a testament to their commitment to maintaining appearances. Yet beneath this veneer of suburban tranquility, there were currents of dissatisfaction and unspoken discontent. Emma Collins, at 18, was the Collins family's shining star. She was known for her radiant smile and diligent work ethic. With plans to attend college and major in environmental science, Emma was the picture of youthful promise. Her days were spent studying, participating in community activities, and dreaming of a future beyond the confines of her small town. However, Emma's seemingly perfect life was overshadowed by a sense of restlessness and a longing for something more, something she couldn't quite articulate. Her parents, Susan and Tom Collins, were both in their mid-40s. Susan, 45, worked as a part-time nurse at the local clinic. She was a figure of authority and discipline in the household, known for her meticulous attention to detail and her commitment to keeping the family's affairs in order. Despite her outwardly controlled demeanor, Susan had been feeling increasingly trapped in a life that she found unfulfilling. Her marriage to Tom had lost its spark, and she often found herself longing for a sense of excitement and recognition that seemed forever out of reach. Tom Collins, 47, worked as a mechanic at a local garage. He was a dependable provider but often distant, consumed by the demands of his job. Tom's long hours at work meant he was rarely present for family dinners or weekend activities. His detachment created a gulf between him and Susan, further straining their relationship. Tom's lack of engagement with his family and his preoccupation with work contributed to the sense of unease that permeated the Collins household. Their life appeared stable, yet cracks began to form beneath the surface. Susan's discontent grew with each passing day, her frustration with Tom's absenteeism and her own unfulfilled ambitions becoming more palpable. She felt a gnawing sense that her life had become a monotonous cycle of responsibilities and unspoken resentments. The arrival of Richard Adams, a 62-year-old retired businessman, disrupted the Collins family's equilibrium. Richard moved into the house next door, a large, somewhat dilapidated Victorian that had been empty for years. He was a reserved man with a mysterious aura, and his presence quickly attracted the curiosity of the town's residents. Richard was known to be a widower, having lost his wife several years earlier, and he now lived alone. From the moment Richard arrived, the dynamics within the Collins household began to shift. Emma, curious about the newcomer, found herself drawn to Richard's enigmatic nature. He was unlike anyone she had ever met. His reserved demeanor and the quiet confidence he exuded were both intriguing and unsettling. Emma was fascinated by his stories of his former life, and their occasional conversations soon became a source of excitement for her. Susan, meanwhile, viewed Richard with a mix of suspicion and fascination. She noticed how his presence seemed to spark a change in Emma. Her daughter, once solely focused on her studies and her routine, now appeared more restless, often disappearing for hours on end. Susan's growing unease was compounded by her own feelings of discontent. The arrival of Richard with his air of mystery only heightened her sense of dissatisfaction and unease. The first sign of trouble came when Emma started to spend more time away from home. She would claim to be studying at the library or meeting friends, but Susan noticed that Emma's excuses became increasingly vague. Her daughter's behavior was erratic, marked by sudden bursts of excitement followed by periods of withdrawal. Susan's suspicions were confirmed one evening when she discovered Emma's diary accidentally left on the kitchen counter. Flipping through the pages, Susan came across entries that hinted at a growing fascination with Richard. Emma's writing revealed a deep emotional connection to her elderly neighbor, something Susan found troubling and perplexing. One entry stood out: "Richard is so different from anyone I've ever met. There's something about him that makes me feel alive in a way I never have before. I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I can't help it. He listens to me in a way no one else does." Susan's heart raced as she read the words, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and anger. She confronted Emma that evening, but her daughter dismissed her concerns with vague explanations about friendship and mentorship. Emma's reluctance to discuss Richard in detail only fueled Susan's suspicions. As Susan grappled with her growing unease, Richard remained an enigmatic figure. His interactions with Emma were polite but distant, and he never gave away much about himself. Despite this, there was an undeniable tension between the two that Susan could not ignore. The turning point came when Susan noticed Emma sneaking out late at night. Driven by a mix of jealousy and fear, Susan decided to follow her daughter. She trailed Emma to Richard's house, her heart pounding with each step. The scene that unfolded before her eyes was both shocking and confusing. Emma and Richard were engaged in a heated conversation on the porch, their closeness unmistakable. Susan's mind raced with questions. What was happening between her daughter and this mysterious man? Why had Emma become so enthralled with him? As she observed from a distance, Susan felt a deep sense of betrayal and anger. Her fears of losing Emma to someone like Richard became a consuming obsession. The arrival of Richard Adams had introduced a new element of instability into the Collins family's lives. His presence had uncovered hidden cracks in their relationships, revealing the deep-seated issues that had been festering beneath the surface. As the days went by, the tension grew, setting the stage for a confrontation that would alter their lives forever. The seemingly perfect facade of the Collins family was beginning to crumble, and the arrival of Richard Adams had been the catalyst for a series of events that would lead to an inevitable and tragic climax. The quiet town of Fairview would soon be thrust into chaos, and the lives of the Collins family would be forever changed by the secrets and desires that lay hidden behind closed doors. The initial unease that Susan Collins felt about Emma's growing interest in Richard Adams soon gave way to a deeper, more pervasive sense of dread. Emma's behavior became increasingly erratic. She started spending long hours away from home under various pretenses: study sessions at the library, late-night walks, and visits to friends. Susan's concerns about Emma's well-being and her apparent detachment from family life only intensified. Unbeknownst to Susan, Emma's secret relationship with Richard Adams had escalated from innocent conversations to a full-blown affair. Their meetings, once confined to the privacy of Richard's home or the nearby woods, had become more frequent and emotionally charged. Richard, with his deep voice and intense gaze, had become a figure of obsession for Emma. Their secret rendezvous were fueled by a mix of excitement and forbidden passion. The secrecy of their affair brought with it a sense of thrill, but also a growing tension. Emma and Richard carefully chose locations and times for their meetings, ensuring that no one would suspect their true relationship. Their late-night encounters in Richard's dimly lit study or the secluded corner of a nearby park were filled with whispered conversations and stolen glances. The thrill of their secrecy only deepened their bond, but it also heightened their risk of discovery. Susan's suspicion grew as she began to piece together Emma's unexplained absences and the increasing frequency of her late-night outings. One evening she decided to follow Emma again, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She watched as Emma left the house and headed in the direction of Richard's home. Susan trailed her at a distance, trying to stay out of sight. Arriving at Richard's house, Susan saw Emma slip through the front door. Her heart raced as she realized that her worst fears were coming true. She waited in the shadows, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. The minutes dragged by, each one stretching her nerves to their breaking point. Eventually, Emma emerged, her face flushed and her demeanor disheveled. Susan's heart ached with betrayal and confusion, and she struggled to understand the nature of her daughter's relationship with the elderly neighbor. That night, Susan confronted Emma once again, but her daughter was evasive. Emma's defensive reactions only fueled Susan's paranoia. Emma claimed she was merely helping Richard with some personal matters, but Susan was not convinced. She felt an urgent need to protect her daughter from what she perceived as Richard's influence. As the days went by, Susan's paranoia took on a life of its own. She became obsessed with uncovering the truth about Emma and Richard. She started keeping a detailed journal of Emma's movements, documenting every time she left the house and every conversation she overheard. The once routine tasks of daily life became a backdrop for Susan's increasingly frantic search for answers. Emma and Richard's secret meetings grew more intense, marked by a sense of urgency and desperation. Emma's feelings for Richard had evolved into something more profound, a mixture of love and dependency. She was drawn to Richard's wisdom and his ability to make her feel special, qualities that she felt were lacking in her own life. Richard, on the other hand, was captivated by Emma's youthful energy and the way she made him feel alive again. One particularly tense evening, Susan caught Emma in a lie. Emma had claimed she was studying at the library, but Susan had seen her car parked near Richard's house. Susan's frustration reached a boiling point, and she decided to confront Richard directly. She visited his home under the pretense of discussing neighborhood matters, but her true intention was to gauge the nature of his relationship with Emma. Richard greeted Susan with his usual calm demeanor, but Susan's presence seemed to unsettle him. During their conversation, Susan's probing questions about Emma's visits were met with Richard's carefully crafted responses. He denied any inappropriate relationship and portrayed himself as a mentor to Emma, offering guidance and support during a challenging time. Susan left his house feeling both frustrated and more convinced of his deceit. Emma and Richard's relationship continued to deepen, but the constant fear of discovery began to take a toll on them both. They were careful to avoid public places where they might be seen together, and their conversations were always whispered and discreet. Despite their efforts, their secret was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. One afternoon, while Emma was at Richard's house, Susan decided to pay an unannounced visit. She had noticed Emma's car parked outside and was determined to confront Richard once and for all. As she approached the house, she noticed the curtains were drawn tightly and the atmosphere seemed unusually tense. Susan knocked on the door, her heart pounding. Richard answered, his face showing a flicker of surprise. He invited Susan inside, and as they talked, Susan noticed the strain in his demeanor. Her mind raced with suspicions, and she could feel the weight of her own anxiety pressing down on her. Richard's attempts to deflect her questions only heightened her sense of unease. As Susan left Richard's house, she felt a growing sense of urgency. She had to find a way to protect Emma from what she believed was a dangerous relationship. The fear of losing her daughter drove Susan to take increasingly irrational steps. She began to stalk Emma more aggressively, often tailing her to and from Richard's house and peering through windows to catch glimpses of their interactions. Emma, for her part, was becoming increasingly frustrated with her mother's intrusive behavior. She felt trapped between her desire for Richard and her fear of her mother's reaction. The secrecy of their affair was becoming a heavy burden, and Emma's emotions were running high. Her relationship with Richard, once a source of joy and excitement, now felt like a dangerous game fraught with the risk of exposure. The tension between Emma and Susan reached a breaking point when Susan discovered Emma's secret hiding place, a small box containing mementos of her relationship with Richard. Among the items were photographs, letters, and other personal artifacts that revealed the depth of their connection. Susan's anger and desperation grew as she realized the extent of Emma's involvement with Richard. One evening, Susan decided to confront Emma with the evidence she had found. The confrontation was heated and emotional, with Susan accusing Emma of being reckless and foolish. Emma, feeling cornered and defensive, lashed out at her mother. The argument ended with Emma storming out of the house, leaving Susan alone with her thoughts. As the days passed, the conflict between Emma and Susan continued to escalate. Emma's feelings for Richard were becoming more complicated, and the pressure of keeping their relationship a secret was taking its toll. Richard, too, was feeling the strain of their clandestine affair and the constant fear of being discovered. Their secret world was on the verge of collapse, and the tension between them reached a critical point. The once thrilling affair had turned into a source of fear and anxiety. As the risks grew higher, the boundaries between passion and danger became increasingly blurred. The chapter closed with a sense of foreboding. The conflict between Susan and Emma, and the secretive relationship between Emma and Richard, had reached a boiling point. The delicate balance that had kept their lives in equilibrium was shattered, setting the stage for a dramatic and tragic confrontation that would forever change their lives. The stage was set for a dramatic climax, and the consequences of the hidden desires and unspoken fears would soon come to a head, leading to an explosive and unforeseen resolution. The tension within the Collins family had reached a breaking point. The hidden affair between Emma Collins and Richard Adams had become a constant source of turmoil, driving Susan Collins to the edge. Emma's increasingly erratic behavior and the secrecy surrounding her relationship with Richard had fueled Susan's paranoia and desperation. One crisp autumn evening, the storm clouds that had been gathering for weeks finally burst. Susan had decided that she needed to confront Emma and Richard one last time, to force a confrontation and reveal the truth. Her frustration with the deceptive web that had ensnared her family had reached its peak. Earlier that day, Susan had followed Emma once more. Emma had left the house with a determined look, heading towards Richard's place. Susan's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anger. She decided this was the moment to take decisive action. As Emma arrived at Richard's house, Susan parked her car a few blocks away and walked toward the Victorian home. Susan approached the house, her breath forming clouds in the chilly evening air. The sky was darkening, casting eerie shadows across the street. She could see through a crack in the curtains that the living room lights were on. With a surge of determination, Susan quietly made her way to the front porch and knocked on the door. Richard opened it, his face showing a flicker of surprise and something akin to apprehension. "Susan, what are you doing here?" he asked, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the tension in his voice. "I need to talk to you and Emma," Susan demanded, pushing her way inside. Richard stepped aside, and Susan entered the house, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, Emma was seated on the sofa, her face showing a mixture of shock and frustration. She had been in the middle of a heated conversation with Richard when Susan barged in. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and the air seemed to crackle with unspoken emotions. "What is the meaning of this?" Susan's voice was sharp, her eyes darting between Emma and Richard. "Why are you letting this continue, Richard? And Emma, how could you do this to your own family?" Emma stood up, her face flushed with a mix of defiance and fear. "Mom, it's not what you think. Richard and I, not what I think." Susan interrupted, her voice rising. "I have seen the letters, the photos. I know everything." The argument escalated quickly. Susan's frustration boiled over into anger. Emma tried to defend herself, but her mother's accusations and the mounting pressure caused her to break down. Richard, trying to mediate, attempted to calm Susan down, but his efforts only seemed to inflame her anger further. In the heat of the moment, Susan's emotions were uncontrollable. She grabbed a nearby lamp, her hands shaking. Emma, desperate to protect Richard, stepped in front of him. Susan's vision was blurred by tears and rage. As she swung the lamp, Emma pushed forward, trying to shield Richard. The lamp struck Emma's head with a sickening thud. Emma collapsed to the floor, her eyes wide with shock and pain. Susan's breath came in ragged gasps as she stared in horror at the scene before her. The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by Emma's labored breathing. Richard rushed to Emma's side, his hands trembling as he tried to help her. "Emma, I'm so sorry," he murmured, tears streaming down his face. Susan, overwhelmed by the realization of what she had done, stood frozen, her mind racing. Panicking, Susan fled the scene, her heart pounding with fear and guilt. She ran to her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and regret. She drove aimlessly, trying to escape the crushing weight of her actions. Richard called for emergency help, his voice breaking as he explained the situation. Paramedics arrived quickly, but despite their efforts, Emma's injuries were too severe. She was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. The news sent shockwaves through the small town of Fairview. The police launched an investigation into the incident, treating it as a suspicious death. Susan's sudden disappearance raised immediate concerns, and she was soon reported as a missing person. Authorities tracked her down at a small motel several hours away, where she had checked in under a false name. Susan was arrested and brought back to Fairview for questioning. During the investigation, the police uncovered the full extent of the hidden affair between Emma and Richard. Susan's journal, detailing her suspicions and observations, was used as evidence. The tragic details of the confrontation were revealed through witness statements and forensic evidence. Susan was charged with manslaughter. Her trial was a media sensation, with the small town watching intently as the events unfolded. The courtroom was filled with a mixture of sympathy and outrage. Emma's death had shaken the community to its core, and the revelations about the affair only added to the scandal. During the trial, Susan's defense argued that her actions had been driven by extreme emotional distress and that she had not intended to kill Emma.